Hello and welcome to my presentation on rocky intertidal zones and the threats present to them in the modern day. I'm Yanina Fayad Parra and I hope you enjoy this presentation. So to begin with, what is the rocky intertidal zone? Well, it's rocky shores where the sea meets the land. There's little to no sand, and it's the area where the tide rises and falls over every day. Some areas are exposed to the sun for longer times than others, and so different animals can live there depending on how much exposure to the open air and the sun they can tolerate. So here's the difference between the high tide and the low tide in this area. Not in Ensenada, but here in this photo. You'll see that when the tide recedes during the low tide, a lot more of the stone is exposed. So the same will be for the animals that live there. So if you can move around, this is not much of a problem. But if you're an animal that is stuck to the stone, like a barnacle or a mussel, you have to have developed some defenses against being outside of the water for extended periods of time, which is why they have those tough shells. They can hold water inside. Here's some other characteristics of the rocky intertidal zone. So there's a lot of different types of rocky intertidal zones because they are present all over the world. Some will have different slopes. For example, on the top left, you can see a very flat stretch of land in a rocky intertidal zone that is mostly just a couple boulders here and there and some occasional tide pools, little depressions in the stone where the water accumulates even after the low tide has receded. So these areas, due to the shape of the land, get hit by much gentler waves. So animals that can't take being battered by harsh waves may be able to thrive there. Compared to the picture on the top right of these coastal cliffs, which also count as rocky intertidal zones as long as they're within the range of the tides, which get battered due to the harsh slope of the land going from the open water to a harsh wall, which means that the waves hit it much harder, and therefore only really hardy animals will be able to survive there. And rocky intertidal zones aren't necessarily composed of just solid chunks of stone, but also they can be made up of pebbles or boulders or just medium sized rocks. As long as it's made of stone and the tides go up and over them, it still counts. So now let's talk about the geomorphology of the rocky intertidal zone. Geomorphology stands for the shape of the earth. So, as we mentioned before, the rocky intertidal zone will either be made of solid or loose stone, and they'll have little sand compared to sandy beaches. Now, we mentioned before the tide pools. These are often seen in rocky intertidal zones. They're little depressions or little gaps in the stone, or just little divots in the stone, where once the tide lowers, the water will still be there. There'll be little pools, therefore the name tidal pools. And since the water is there, and the animals can't go back to the open water, you'll often see little animals stranded there until the high tide comes back up. So these will be feeding opportunities for seabirds and other animals who can't fish in the open water as effectively. Now, these rocky intertidal zones, they tend to form at the bases of mountains, volcanic islands, and coastal cliffs. At the bases of mountains, because the mountains are made up of hard stone, so as they get eroded over time, they'll have their rock exposed due to the waves taking away the loose sediment, leaving behind just the bare stone. Volcanic islands, because, well, they start off as entirely stone. And coastal cliffs, again because the sediment is being dragged away by the waves much more harshly compared to other areas. The glaciers can also be responsible for taking away the sediment due to the slow movement over the land, taking away even the large boulders. And as they melt, of course, the flowing water will also move the sediment to the open ocean. And the rocky intertidal tend to be made up of stones like granite, basalt, and limestone because they are tough and resistant to erosion. And there's what has been left after the many years of erosion by the waves. Here's some more different examples of tidal pools. So depending on the area, they have different types of animals that live there. Some will be more friendly to algae, some have higher fish populations. It really just depends on the area. Now, the rocky intertidal zone is characterized by its separation in vertical areas. This is called vertical zonation. So you'll see over in the lower intertidal zone, which tends to be mostly covered by water even during the low tide. You see a lot more animals and plants that can't handle being outside the water for long. In the middle intertidal zone, this area tends to hit the middle ground between being covered by the high tide and being exposed by the low tide. So you see a variety of animals like crabs and snails and such that can tolerate being outside the water for a while. And the high intertidal zone, also called the splash zone because they get splashed by the foam of the waves, which tends to be almost always exposed to the water and holds much hardier animals like the previously mentioned shelled animals like mussels and barnacles. Their shells hold the water within them, so they don't get desiccated quite that quick. And as we mentioned before, here's the different levels of the rocky shore vertical zones. So at the top, the armored animals that can tolerate the exposure to the open air, and at the bottom, the animals that can't be outside the water. Here's more examples of the rocky shore vertical zonation. As you see there, you can see bands stretching over the land, depending on how of the shelled animals up top. And as you go deeper, you start seeing the more water-dependent animals. Now we speak of the temporal and spatial scales of the rocky intertidal zone. To begin with, scales are, for example, in the temporal scales, the small side of the temporal scale will have events that take place over small periods of time, like seconds, minutes, hours, and over the large side of the temporal scale, you will see events that take over months and years and decades and centuries. On the other side, the spatial scale would be events that take over in different areas. So a small spatial scale would be centimeters or meters or so. And if we move into the large spatial scale, we start moving into the kilometers and the miles and just the entire world eventually. So events that happen events that happen in a rocky intertidal zone. For example, the movement of individual animals tend to take place over small temporal scales and small spatial scales because they don't move over very large distances, and that movement doesn't take very long. So it's in a small temporal scale and a small spatial scale. Erosion has a much wider range. It it falls into the medium to large temporal scale because it takes time. It takes place over large stretches of time. It, and it falls into also the medium to large size of the spatial scale because it so happen in either specific areas or worldwide. It just depends what specifically you're eroding. The rise and fall of the tides has a small temporal scale but a large spatial scale because it takes place over just periods of time of hours and days, but it takes place all over the world, so it falls into a large spatial scale. In climate change, which we're going to be going into detail about how it affects the rocky intertidal zone, is an event that takes place both in a large and temporal and spatial scales because it's been happening since the beginning of the Earth's conception, and it takes place over the entire world. It's just that nowadays it's been accelerating due to human activity. And another topic, here's some ecological processes that occur in the intertidal zone. Ecological processes are processes that take place in ecosystems that define their populations and such, and control how the ecosystem develops. For example, primary production is the little plants and microalgae making biomass that then gets eaten by herbivores and then gets eaten by other animals, therefore adding mass into the food cycle. That's where it all begins. Predation, which is animals eating other animals, and therefore allowing the predator to grow and reproduce and killing off the smaller animal and allowing either something to take its place where it once was, or taking it out of the food chain completely if it's unbalanced. Competition. This is seen due to the rocky intertidal zones having limited habitat. Animals will compete with each other over the perfect spots to be in. Where, for example, it seems that these barnacles and mussels are competing over a choice spot where they manage to anchor on, and there's enough water to survive. So they're going to be competing with each other over how much space they can take up. But they'll not only be competing against other species, but also against other members of their community. This is called intraspecific, and which is the competition between the same species, and interspecific, which is competition between the different species. And another ecological process is reproduction. So these communities of barnacles exchanging genetic material and expanding their population in the area. And some other ones include respiration, which is animals taking oxygen out of the water in order to convert the food in their bodies into energy. Precipitation, which is the rain coming in and lowering the level of salinity in the water, which may kill off some animals if it's enough of it. And animals moving to different areas in their intertidal zone, so there will be less food for our opportunistic predators coming in once the tide recedes. So it must be good to be a crab. They can live wherever they want. Here's some Here I'll present some patterns in the intertidal zone. So the one that defines the intertidal zone is the rise and the fall of the tides, depending on the area, and it can be diurnal tides, which take place. There's a rise and fall in a single day, semi-diurnal, which there's 2 rises and falls of the tides in the day, and mixed semi-diurnal, where there'll be 2 rises and falls of the tides, but some of the tides will extend for one of the cycles of the tides will reach different areas than the second. There are seasonal changes, like the winter bringing in stronger storms, which will batter the shore and kill off some populations that were not prepared to handle such harsh waves. There's daily changes, which we can see every day, that the sun comes up and down, exposing the animals to solar radiation, allowing for photosynthesis and for animals to be baked in the heat. It's the removal of organisms, which happens at random depending on predation or events like storms, which will open up more space for something else to come in to live where the animal died, and allowing other animals to feed on the animals that were removed. And spatial zonation, which we mentioned before, which happens in every rocky intertidal zone. Here's some common animals you'll see. For example, on the top right, you see a hermit crab and a snail. Right on the top left of that, on the left of that, on the top, you'll see a seabird. Below that, a small fish that was trapped in the tide pool and therefore may be exposed to predators a while if it doesn't have a good place to hide. On the top and the middle, you'll see some anemones, which can handle being inside or outside of the water. Which can handle being outside of the water for a while, because they curl up, preserving the water and the bodies inside them. On the top left, you'll see different kinds of algae, which come in all shapes and sizes, some which are more tolerant to being exposed to the air than others. Below that, you'll see common brown sea hare, which is a soft-bodied animal that is mostly made up of water, and it does not have armor, so it must stay moist in order to survive, so it won't stick to the splash zone where there's low to no water. And the previously mentioned crab, which will move around depending on its liking of how moist or how dry the area is and where food can be found. Now, the rocky intertidal zones are connected to other coastal ecosystems. Estuaries will allow the flow of fresh water, which will limit the animals that can live in that particular area, because some of them won't like being in the fresh water. The coastal seas, which are sometimes provided with new individuals that have grown up in the coastal area and moved down into the open waters, and when the tide comes up, the animals may come in from the open sea to feed on the now exposed animals in the rocky intertidal zone. And coastal cliffs, which may often be rocky intertidal zones themselves, but if they're not exposed to the water, then they don't. But if they're not touched by the tides, then they don't count, and they get hit by much harsher waves, and are homes to animals like birds, which will take advantage of their position close to the rocky intertidal zone to feed. Now, the rocky intertidal zone provides a lot of ecosystemic services. The ecosystem just being there It provides a lot of benefits. For example, protection of the shore against storms due to the strength of the stone. It will be a source of food for all the animals nearby. It can be in nurseries for animals that will be eaten in the open waters. So it's a safe place to spawn for some animals. Of course, it is home to the animals in the rocky and tidal zone. And some of these animals, like the mussels, will purify the water due to their filter feeding, which is when they filter out particles from the water to consume, which is a process that inevitably eats the toxins in the water as well. It has a lot of value to human visitors and to commercial activity, because people love to come by and see the animals and explore the shore. And for example, this family here may be going out just doing what they love to do, to just enjoy the ecosystem that is there. Now, this is a terrible shame, but just like all other coastal ecosystems, these valuable ecosystems are under threat because of pollution. So, sewage, chemicals, runoff, trash being dumped there, or floating in from the sea. The toxic algal blooms that happen when there's too many nutrients in the water from that pollution, which can either release toxins into the water, killing off anything besides the algae, or trigger eutrophication, which is algae going crazy over the increased nutrients, then them not being to keep their reproduction and dying off, and the bacteria coming in and eating them, which takes up all the oxygen in the water and kills off a lot of the animals. And you know how I mentioned that the shellfish will filter out toxins? So these toxins will start accumulating in their bodies, and when animals eat them, they will also receive those toxins in their bodies, even if they're not in the polluted water. And it moves up into the trophic chain. And as you see there in the bottom left, even humans are not safe from it if they decide to eat shellfish and filter feeders in tainted waters. Another threat is overexploitation. Of course, these areas being of commercial value for fishing and tourism also means that there's going to be unfortunate events of too many people coming over and trampling the plants, or taking too many animals from the ecosystem, which doesn't allow them to reproduce as much as they were before with healthier adult populations. Because we will tend to grab the largest animals, which would be the ones that were already ready to reproduce, or the ones that were valuable to their species because they were survivors. So it will threaten not only how much they can reproduce, but the value of the individuals that can reproduce. And trampling tends to affect algae heavily because they can take quite a while to come back after being stepped on by heavy boots. Structure development is another threat. People will move around the sediment, which may bury the rocks under sand, removing the habitat or severely altering it. They may separate different areas due to the new structures, which will effectually make the habitat into two, which will affect the animals that can reach each other and reproduce or feed on each other. And of course, development will also bring more pollution. And here's a big one: climate change. Now, some of the Some of the effects of climate change include the rising sea levels due to the melting ice, the acidification of the water due to all the extra carbon dioxide in the air becoming acid in the ocean when it gets absorbed, dissolving the calcium shells of small developing animals and the adults as well, making them brittle or just not allowing their babies to grow up. There's the warming waters expands the range of other animals, so some areas may suffer invasive species. The animals will Some animals will come in and outcompete everything else, reducing the biodiversity of the area. And the stronger storms will also batter areas more severely than they were already used to be dealing with. And we will explore the sea level rise a little more in depth. There's only so much area of rocky intertidal zones. The beaches will be the first things to be submerged when the water sea level rises. And as the habitat is lost, the animals will have less space to live that they've already been compared over, because there's only so much space over for them to live on. There'll be less prey for the animals that live by the coast. The 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 biodiversity will suffer because of the loss of habitat, possibly driving out species from where they were living. And it may take quite a while for the some areas will be completely submerged, removing the some areas may be completely submerged if they have gentle slopes, so that complete rocky intertidal zone will be lost, just becoming another part of the coastal sea. And it could take many years before erosion goes on to create a new rocky intertidal zone in that area. Now here's a picture detailing the sea levels that are projected to rise in California, which is very close to Baja California, of course. To the left, you'll see the increases in feet. In the bottom, you'll see the ranges of the years that have the ranges in the years that the years by which these increases will have been predicted. So you'll see in 2100, just a mere 80 years away, like a lifetime for a person. A person could be born and live to see, in the best case scenario, the sea rise up by 2.5 feet, which would be around 50 centimeters, or in a much worse case scenario, up to 7 feet, which would be about around 1.5 meters, which may not seem like much, but when you consider that much volume of water and the different slopes of the shores, some areas might be completely submerged depending on how much the sea level rises. Either way, it's an inevitable habitat loss. Here are some projections of habitat loss in Australia that could happen due to sea level rise. On the top left, you'll see a graph that shows the areas that could remain after the sea level rise on the percentages on the left, and on the bottom how it happens over the years. So these lines show different projections. So the green line you see there is a best case scenario, barely to no the least amount of sea level rise that could happen, which in 50 years would mean that the Australian coast would have lost about 5% of their habitat. Not too bad, definitely not good, but still recoverable. But in a much worse case scenario, in the red line could be a loss in 50 years. It could be a loss of 20% of the intertidal rocky shores, which would be a much more horrible blow to by the diversity of the area and the habitat available to the animals. When it comes to global sea level rise, you can see on the top graph, you see level rise in centimeters on the left, and the bottom how it's been going on, how it goes on over the years. So the yellow line shows what we have seen so far, and the lines that continue off from that point are the different speculations will be made. The blue line is the mentioned best case scenario, which will be just about 50 centimeters in about 80 years. Not too horrible, survivable, but still will be a devastating blow to a lot of places, especially those that have gentle slopes, which will be submerged much more easily. The worst case scenario we saw before would be that red line, which would be up to a meter in height in sea level rise, which would be easily twice as worse. And the purple line you see there is the worst case scenario, which will be us continuing our activities and doing absolutely nothing about climate change and allowing the sea level to rise up to its maximum according to all the melted water, which will rise the water up to make the sea level rise by 2.5 meters in just 80 years, which would be not only a severe loss of habitat to the limited rocky and intertidal zones, but also an extremely dangerous scenario for human populations. So many of our people live around the coast. It will be some immense flooding. It'd be intense storms. It'd be submerged cities, just like the submerged populations in the rocky intertidal zone. We really have to be careful. We really have to support watching out our carbon dioxide emissions and slowing down climate change as soon as possible. So hopefully we never have to see that worst case scenario for not only the rocky intertidal zones to be submerged, but also our homes and the places we live.